Very good morning, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests, and dedicated advocates for climate action. The Embassy of the United States of America has been a steadfast supporter in driving conversations on energy innovation and sustainable development. With your partnership, Climate Governance Malaysia is honored to welcome you to today's webinar, Where Does Nuclear Energy Fit the Energy Transition? I'd like to now pass the floor to Dato Tong to introduce the speakers and kick us off. Over to you, Dato.
Thank you. Welcome and good morning, everyone. Just before we start, for those who need it, please switch on your Zoom auto caption for closed captioning. We're recording this webinar on the 9th of January 2025. So on behalf of Climate Governance Malaysia, I would like to welcome all of you to part 2 of Where Does Nuclear Energy Fit in the Energy Transition by Judi Greenwald of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. We'd like to thank the US Embassy and the US Department of State also for their support in bringing this to us. In part 1 recorded last month, Judi Greenwald, the Executive Director of Nuclear Innovation Alliance, walked us through the basics of nuclear energy. In other words, a nuclear energy 101. Today, in part 2, she will share the way forward using the US and other examples from around the world, and also address some of the in-depth questions that were raised by the audience in part 1. Now, before we dive into Judy's presentation, let us hear from representatives from both Climate Governance Malaysia and the US Department of State. So to kick us off, I would like to invite Dr. Sri Johan Raslan, Council Member of Climate Governance Malaysia, to share his opening remarks. Over to you, Johan.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tong. Ladies and gentlemen, it's essential that we recognize the critical moment we're living in. Last year, Southeast Asia faced record-breaking heat waves with temperatures soaring above 45 degrees and heat indices surpassing 50 degrees Celsius. The result, widespread heat stroke and severe strain on our infrastructure. In November, the Philippines endured 6 consecutive typhoons in just 30 days. The first 2 alone tragically claimed 160 lives, displaced 600,000 people, and impacted over 9 million. So talk about record-breaking. As global temperatures continue to rise, these record-breaking events are sort of becoming the norm. Threats to lives, livelihoods, and economies are compounded by rising sea levels, biodiversity loss, and surging energy demands. Add to that the increasing needs of a growing global population and expanding infrastructure. Addressing this climate crisis requires solutions that are ambitious, equitable, and practical. Transforming our energy systems is no longer an option, but a necessity. We must deliver clean, reliable, and affordable power while safeguarding the planet and supporting economic growth. However, we need more than just technologies. We need the capacity to deploy them effectively. This means, of course, building expertise, fostering collaboration, and ensuring that we can adapt global solutions to meet our local context. Against this backdrop, CGM, in collaboration with the United States Embassy in Kuala Lumpur, is proud to present this 2-part webinar series entitled Where Does Nuclear Energy Fit in the Energy Transition? In part 1, as mentioned, we provided an introduction to nuclear energy, how it works, the benefits, and the latest advances. For those who missed it, that session is available on our official CGM YouTube channel. Today, it's deep dive time into some critical questions. What capacity does Malaysia need to use nuclear energy? How can we build the technical, financial, and regulatory frameworks needed to ensure safety, efficiency, and public confidence? Most importantly, what lessons can we draw from global experiences as we chart Malaysia's path forward? I'd like to extend our sincere gratitude to the US Embassy and the US State Department for the support of this series, as well as to the esteemed speakers joining us today. Really looking forward to this. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a great opportunity for us. Let's use it to learn, engage, and build a sustainable energy future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. So now I'd like to introduce Justin Friedman. Justin is the Senior Advisor for Commercial Competitiveness in Nuclear Energy in the Bureau of International Security and Non-Proliferation at the Department of State. He is responsible for developing and implementing whole-of-government strategies to support civil nuclear power projects, which adhere to the highest international standards of security, non-proliferation, and safety while advancing clean energy transitions globally. Justin, I welcome you to share your opening remarks. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Datuk Tong. It's a real pleasure for me to be with this audience in Malaysia. I'm speaking to you from Northern Virginia, where 45 degrees would be wonderful. Right now, we're at about -10. We had a big snowstorm just 2 days ago, and so I'd love a little bit of warm weather, but it's a true pleasure and honor to be here. I'd like to welcome everyone who's joined us this morning for you, this evening for me, but this morning to discuss, to join for the second in our two-part series on nuclear energy. If the first session was focused on the why nuclear, as I understand it, this session will focus more on the how to do nuclear. And I want to start and finish with the most important point from my remarks, which is when you make a decision, and that's not a guarantee, it's your decision to make, Malaysia, but when you make a decision about nuclear energy, we would urge you to do it to the highest international standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation. That is part of my core mission, but it's also the core mission of the United States to ensure that as countries make their own decisions about nuclear energy, they do so to those very high standards that we've worked for over 70 years to develop and share with our partners. I also want to share my gratitude to our Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs, which is funding, along with our embassy in Malaysia, this seminar, or webinar, I should say. But also I'd like to thank the Climate Governance Malaysia for being our hosts and doing such a wonderful job of organizing this event and bringing our experts to bear for this conversation. A little bit more about me. I apologize. I'm wearing glasses so I can see my remarks, but I see that it's reflecting a little bit, so I'm going to take them off and be a little bit crazy with my remarks. I hope you'll forgive me for that. A little bit about me. I am a 30-year career diplomat, and I am a recovering hydrocarbonaholic. What that means is over my career, I've spent a lot of time working on advancing projects that deliver hydrocarbons safely to consumers around the world, including oil and gas pipelines in Azerbaijan, Georgia, and Turkey. But also when I was Deputy Chief of Mission in Brunei about 15 years ago, working with our partners in Brunei to help them ensure that they could deliver their natural gas to customers around the world. But as I said, I'm a recovering hydrocarbonaholic because for the last 3 years, I've been working in the nuclear energy space. And my goal is to work with partners to help them make smart decisions about nuclear energy. Smart decisions means having an informed public. It means understanding the technologies involved, understanding the economics involved, and making wise decisions that ultimately will reflect the interest of your people and your economic development and growth. And so that's my mission and why I'm delighted to be part of this webinar today. Malaysia is not alone. Many countries in the ASEAN region are looking very seriously at nuclear energy. I think you've probably seen public announcements from Indonesia and the Philippines, to name two, that are moving projects, some with direct support from the United States through our Trade Development Agency, to do serious feasibility studies to look at specific sites to implement nuclear projects. I'm delighted that Malaysia is now starting on this path and is making a very serious and thoughtful approach to nuclear energy, and we want to be your partner on that path. One of our tools that we have to help our partners make smart decisions and build their own capacities to understand nuclear and how to use it responsibly is a program called FIRST. FIRST is a mouthful. The acronym stands for the Foundational Infrastructure for the Responsible Use of Small Modular Reactor Technology. What that means is we work in partnership with the IAEA, and you'll learn more about something called the milestones process in the course of today's conversation. but we work in partnership with the IAEA to help countries make decisions and decide whether and how to move forward on the milestones process. And first is a partnership program. We're not alone in implementing it. We have partnerships with Japan, Korea, Canada, and the UK to help us implement this program. So it's a not just a US program, but it's a global program, and it's technology neutral. So we don't advertise technology. We provide options and thoughts to help you think through your own best solutions for these challenges. I'm very impressed that you're thinking about climate transition, you're thinking about energy transition, and that you're making a commitment to consider nuclear as part of that. The whys you'll discuss more in this seminar, but for me, the answer goes back to where I started, which is that we want to see it done responsibly and done well. And I'm fully convinced, having visited KL a couple of times in a professional capacity over my career, that the people of Malaysia can make smart and wise decisions about how to use nuclear in their energy mix. One of the words you'll hear a lot is something called small modular reactors, or SMRs. The United States is at the leading edge in implementing SMR technology. We have projects under development in various phases in states ranging from Wyoming to Texas to Tennessee, and I include Ontario, Canada, and I won't make a joke about comments from our soon-to-be president about our relationship with Canada, but I will say that we consider Canada a very close partner with us in implementing nuclear energy projects. And so the United States is making that decision too, that we want to expand our nuclear capacity. In fact, we've committed to triple our nuclear capacity by 2050 to meet our climate and energy security objectives. So, but we're not doing this alone. We're also working in partnership with countries like Romania and Poland. And my last overseas assignment country was Bulgaria. They are working very seriously. This week, I've had conversations with Turkey. I've had conversations in recent weeks with Kuwait, with Bahrain. So Malaysia is not alone in walking this path. You're walking with some very good and capable partners. And the most important thing is that we would love to be one of your partners as you make this walk along this path. I think I want to wrap it up there. I want to thank you all for joining. I want to thank you for making the commitment to educate yourself as you move forward and make smart and educated decisions for Malaysia about your energy future. So once again, thank you very much for joining this evening, or this morning, I should say, and I hope you enjoy the webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin, for those aspirational and encouraging remarks. I think there's a lot we can learn from the UX experience of over 50 years. So now, before we get started, here is the agenda moving forward and a couple of simple housekeeping rules. Judi will now come on and present to us for about 30 minutes, following which I will moderate a Q&A session for about 45 minutes with a hard stop at 11:30 this morning. So please help us by posting your questions in the Q&A section throughout the webinar and not in the chat box, so we only look at one place. And as a caveat, and to be fair to those who joined us in part one, I reserve the right to maybe defer some of the repeated questions from part one and encourage us, especially the questions that cover the basics, and encourage us all to review part one's recording after this webinar so that we can focus on, as Johan said earlier, taking a deep dive with questions that are raised from Judi's presentation today. So once again, Judi Greenwald is the Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. Over to you, Judi.
Thanks so much for having me. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, you sound good.
Okay. So I'm going to share screen. Hope that this works. And let's make sure. Yeah.
Yep, you started screen sharing and it's on, but we see your screensaver, I think.
And how about now?
Yep, the presentation's up. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, thanks so much for having me again. And really appreciate appreciate the opportunity to share with you what we know and help you all move forward as you see best. So this is part 2 of where does nuclear energy fit in the energy transition. And I'm the executive director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. And just a little recap, I talked about this last time about who is NIA. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan think and do tank based in Washington, D.C. And our mission is to help create the conditions for success for advanced nuclear energy so that it can play a major role as a climate and energy security solution. NIA identifies barriers, performs technical analysis, and engages with stakeholders and policymakers to inform policy and catalyze action. We are known, among other things, for our geeky reports with pretty colors. And here are a few examples of recent reports we did from reactors to repositories, which is about waste from advanced nuclear reactors. We had a new nuclear project development paper, which talked about how do you actually get early mover projects going. We have an advanced nuclear reactor technology compendium, which talks about different companies in the nuclear space. And we also have a advanced reactor technology primer, which gives you the basics on nuclear energy. And this is on advanced nuclear energy. And these are just a few of our many, many reports. So please feel free to check out our websites where you can learn pretty much anything you want to know about advanced nuclear energy. Little recap of part 1 for those of you who missed it or who it's for whom anything that happened before the holiday seems like a long time ago. What we talked about is how nuclear energy can play a major role in creating a clean energy economy. Advanced reactors have a wide array of different commercial use cases. Recent agreements and investments demonstrate momentum. Nuclear energy is safe. Nuclear waste is stored safely. And demand for nuclear energy is growing from the tech and industrial sectors and beyond. What we're going to focus on today are goals for nuclear energy build-out, conditions for success, paths forward, and costs. A little bit about global nuclear energy build-out goals. Efforts to deploy new nuclear energy will aid in energy security and global decarbonization. Since 2023, more than 20 countries from 4 continents have pledged to triple nuclear energy by 2050, and nuclear energy can help nations achieve their commitments under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is how we think about the conditions for success for new nuclear energy here in the US. This is our framing, but I think a lot of folks in the US would agree with this basic approach. The bottom half of the slide are the conditions as we see them for success, and that's competitive cost, getting to market, public acceptance, and scaling. And the timing we need is demonstration in the 2020s and commercialization in the 2030s and beyond. And the top half of the slide is our view that a whole of society effort is needed from industry, government, civil society, customers, communities, and investors. In the US context, it is largely on industry to achieve a lot of these conditions for success, especially competitive cost and getting to market and scaling. Different countries will have different approaches where the different players might take different roles. But in the US, the industry has a very strong role. And I think a lot of the way we think about it is it's industry-led and government enabled. And so we see a lot of roles, not just for industry, but also for government, also civil society, very strong role in the US. We at NIA are part of civil society. Customers have a strong role, communities and investors as well. But I think if industry can't make this work, it's really going to be very difficult. We also think in the US context that licensing modernization at the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission is really important, and I'll get into that a little bit later. Public investment is very important to facilitate rapid private innovation. And of course, greater private financial sector and public investment are needed in a mutually complementary fashion for global decarbonization at scale. A little bit about US capacity, activity, and plans. We talked a little bit about this last time. We now have about 100 gigawatts of nuclear in the United States, and this goal of tripling that was just mentioned is to get to 300 gigawatts. To get there, we are working on Nuclear Regulatory Commission reform, public-private partnerships, tax credits, and heavy private sector activity, particularly most recently by IT companies. This picture on the right was a report that we did a couple of years ago. This was actually before the US made this commitment to 300 gigawatts. We talked about doubling nuclear energy production, which we actually thought was ambitious at the time. And now, of course, there's this even more ambitious goal out there. And this is an interesting paper if you're interested in looking at sort of the set of activities that we think these various players from civil society to industry and the government need to do in order to achieve success. So this might be a report of interest to you all, at least for the US context, and obviously it would need to be tailored for Malaysia or any other country. Particularly on the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the challenge and opportunity we have in the US is we have a well-established nuclear regulator. The issues we have are that the regulations that we have are tailored to conventional nuclear power plants, and also that our licensing process is not efficient enough. And so we're working hard as part of the whole civil society as well as the government on solutions, and that involves both regulatory reforms at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission as well as improvement of applications by industry. We think it takes both good applications as well as a good regulator to have successful nuclear regulation. And so this is a very high priority for our sector in the United States and something where many of us are working very hard on. We talked about this last time, but just to recap, US public-private partnerships are accelerating the demonstration and deployment of advanced reactors. This is sort of key to what is happening in the US. You'll hear about lots of different projects that are happening, and just about all of them have some type of public-private partnership where there is government funding in partnership with private sector investment, and they mutually leverage one another. And it's really important to have both, in our view. You really need the commercial wisdom of the private sector to figure out what's going to really work in the marketplace. And you also need the government support for early movers, because there are higher risks for first movers. And you really do need that public investment to jumpstart and catalyze these early mover projects. And then we expect that ultimately they'll be primarily private sector funded. There's also been a recent set of agreements. We talked a little bit about this last time between Google and Kairos. Kairos is an advanced nuclear developer. Amazon X Energy, another nuclear developer, and Energy Northwest, which is a US utility, public utility, and Microsoft and Constellation. And Constellation is a nuclear developer as well. And these recent agreements where we have both nuclear energy developers and IT companies who are very hungry for clean, firm energy, partnering on committing to a set of projects and build out so that we can actually build out this sector and get more projects online and really get to achieve those goals that I showed earlier. We have several US tax credits that were enacted in 2022 under a law called the Inflation Reduction Act. All of these are quite important. There's something called a production tax credit or PTC. This applies to all forms of clean electricity production, including advanced nuclear energy. We also have an investment tax credit, again, for all types of clean electricity. And this is very important and an important incentive. We also have a manufacturing tax credit for manufacturing equipment that's in the supply chain for clean energy technologies. And we also have a hydrogen tax credit, which includes any type of clean production of hydrogen, including nuclear energy. These technology neutral tax credits have very broad support in the United States. And so we're very cautiously optimistic that they will remain in force and be an important part of our future approach to getting clean energy on the grid, and also more broadly in the industrial sector and in producing fuels like hydrogen. So this is an important policy lever that is really an important piece of how we think we're going to get to success. As you may know, these types of tax credits were very important in the early stages of renewables in the United States, and we are looking to replicate that success for all clean energy technologies, including renewables. This is a modified version of the slide that I showed earlier. The bottom half is the same conditions for success: competitive costs, getting to market, public acceptance, getting demos in the 2020s, and commercialization in the 2030s and beyond. But I adjusted the top a little bit to be a little bit more open about what different types of countries or countries at different stages might be interested. We think still you need a whole of society effort. You know, industry is super important, but so is government, civil society, customers, communities, investors, and in some countries, other parts of the whole society, especially government, might have a stronger role or a less role, depending on where you are. We do think, particularly for countries who are new to nuclear energy, that early engagement with the international nuclear energy community can be super helpful to learn what others have learned and benefit from that experience, and also to identify potential partners to get going. We think you need an efficient development of a nuclear regulatory authority or licensing body. You know, we already have that in the United States, but we're looking to reform it. But people have to have that in order to have a successful nuclear energy sector. And so getting that going is really important. Development of an in-country workforce to sustain operations is really important over time. Certainly the early projects can benefit from the international workforce, but you do over time want to develop a supply chain that has a lot of domestic content and support. And then it's important to engage with potential partners, investors, and stakeholders, both in country and abroad. I'll give an example of South Korea. We talked last time about Japan. I'll mention South Korea because they've been important in another project, which I'm going to talk about. South Korea has 26 operable reactors, 2 under construction, and their current operating capacity is about 26 gigawatts. And their main nuclear developer, the Korean Electric Power Corporation, or KEPCO, is the developer and constructor of APR 1400 reactor technology. And they have some key international projects. In particular, they've completed the 4 APR 1400s at Bukit nuclear project in 2024 in the United Arab Emirates. So the United Arab Emirates is an early in their journey on nuclear energy, but they have built a few plants. The KEPCO has also signed a deal to build 4 APR 1400s in Turkey, and they're in talks to build a plant in the UK. And in Korea is an example, I would say somewhat more so than the United States, with a very strong government role, perhaps even more government-centric than the US. A little more about the United Arab Emirates. They did early engagement with the US, the EU, and the International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, and those partners were key to setting up their nuclear regulator. And they relied on international workforce as they developed their domestic workforce, so that it was a transition. They weren't starting from scratch. The Baraka UAE plant is a 5,600 megawatt, 4 units, Korean KEPCO design. They staggered their construction and commissioning over 2012 to 2024 so that they could learn from what they were doing in the early stages of the early reactors, of the early units, so that they could reap those lessons and gain from learning by doing for the latter unit. So that was an important benefit to the way that they did their construction. KEPCO was the prime contractor, reactor supplier, and project and operating joint venture partner. We would say that the UAE conditions for success was strong government support, robust local community support, strong cooperation across developers, the regulators, stakeholders, and supply chain, and using the IAEA milestone approach, which I'll say a little bit about. IAEA has come up with this milestones approach about how you go about doing nuclear power infrastructure development. Obviously, this isn't to be prescriptive, more to be a general guide and to be tailored to each individual country's needs. Their view is you start with nuclear power option being included in a national energy strategy. Milestone 1 is ready to make a knowledgeable commitment to a nuclear power program. Milestone 2 is to be ready to invite bids and negotiate a contract for the first nuclear power plant. And milestone 3 is ready to commission and operate the first nuclear power plant. Phase 1 includes considerations before a decision to launch a nuclear power program is taken. Phase 2 is preparatory work for the contracting and construction of a nuclear power plant after policy decision has been taken. And phase 3 is activities to implement the first nuclear power plant. Their view is that this takes about 10 to 15 years. Potentially, it could go faster if you're in a hurry. We're certainly in a hurry to address climate and energy security issues, but these are definitely, these are phases are things that have to happen and must be done appropriately. And certainly you don't want to cut any corners, but certainly with dedication, you could potentially go faster. For the first nuclear power plant project, there are pre-project activities, project development, final investment decision, which include contracting and construction, and then commissioning, operation, and then ultimately decommissioning. A little bit about U.S. resources. We heard a little bit about this earlier. We have the Ex-Im Bank, which offers financing, including export credit insurance, working capital guarantees, loan guarantees, and direct loans. That requires a 123 agreement, which is a commitment to meet non-proliferation guidelines. There's the Foundation Infrastructure for Responsible Use of Small Modular Reactor Technology, or FIRST. We heard about that a little bit earlier. And this is a capacity building program to deepen strategic ties, support energy innovation, and advance technical collaboration with partner nations on secure and safe nuclear energy infrastructure. And this is a U.S. State Department program. The U.S. Department of Energy facilitates deployment of U.S. energy technologies globally by supporting U.S. energy companies entering new markets. And we have this report that the US DOE did called Pathways to Commercial Liftoff, Advanced Nuclear Report. They did a series of these liftoff reports, and the Advanced Nuclear one is very valuable. It has a lot of really useful information, and I commend it to you. And then, of course, the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission has an international office. They engage pretty actively with other countries on nuclear energy and materials regulation and are an important potential resource for you all. We got a lot of questions about cost last time, and so I'll talk a little bit about this. And it's important to give a little bit of context on cost, and so that when you're looking at costs that you ask some questions and make sure that, that you're not just looking at the numbers, but understanding what the numbers mean. So typically you'll see costs for power in terms of levelized cost of electricity, or LCOE. But that doesn't really give a complete picture. Nuclear power plants benefit electric grid reliability and provide grid services. So if you only look at LCOE, you won't get the full benefit picture. The other thing you have to be careful when you look at cost, or you have to look at whether you're talking about first of a kind versus nth of a kind, because there's this value of learning by doing. So the first of a kind of any particular technology is going to be more expensive than the nth of a kind, and we do get better at this with experience. So it's very important to think about and understand whether you're looking at the cost for the first of a kind versus the nth of a kind. It's also important to look at whether you're looking at costs with or without policy incentives. Policy incentives, especially tax credits, can make a big difference on what the perceived or what the experienced cost is of any technology. And you also have to look at cost in a decarbonized world versus a carbon emitting world. If you're not trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then you won't value nuclear energy as much as if you're trying to decarbonize your grid, in which case the value of the zero carbon electricity that nuclear energy produces is extremely high. And because of all these important caveats, the most appropriate comparison for nuclear power is with other clean, firm options if you're going to use the LCOE metric so that you're comparing like to like. This chart on the side shows new nuclear LCOE before and after the IRA impact. The IRA, as I mentioned, was the Inflation Reduction Act, which had these tax credits. And they this is from this LPO report that I mentioned. And this is an example of sort of a high case of 10,000 per kilowatt versus a lower case for 5,000 per kilowatt. Probably one way to think about this is a first of a kind versus the nth of a kind. And then they have three scenarios with no tax credits, with the production tax credit and the investment tax credit And of course, you can see that these tax credits make a big difference, and certainly that learning by doing makes a big difference. And depending on the investment that you need, you can wind up with more value with one type of tax credit or another. In particular, the bigger your capital investment, the more the ITC benefits. So a little bit more on this cost issue. Capital costs drive levelized cost of electricity, especially for early movers. And this shows the impact of varying overnight capital costs on nuclear levelized cost of electricity. And the dark green is the capital cost, the light green is fixed operating, the sort of medium green is variable operating costs. And then below the line are these tax credits. And in this particular case, they're looking at the 30% investment tax credit. And you can see that for the higher capital costs, the more valuable the tax credit is. And also, you can also see as you go down, presumably over time, as we do learning by doing, that the costs get lower, and then you would reduce your need for having these incentives like tax credits. But particularly for the early projects, these tax credits can be enormously important. A little bit more on what these costs are about. What's included in capital and upfront costs are licensing and construction activities, equipment, and initial fuel costs. The initial fuel load is an important thing that has to happen in order to turn on a plant. Financing costs, debt servicing, and equity returns, and then operations and maintenance includes personnel costs, regulatory fees, insurance, and refueling costs. And in the US context, not every licensing agency is like this. We have the cost that the reactor applicant, the company has to pay to get ready for licensing and prepare their side of the of what they have to do to create an application. But they also in the US have to pay the fees for Nuclear Regulatory Commission to review their application. So they have to pay sort of both sides of the licensing process. Again, on this LCOE not giving the complete picture, it doesn't account for resource dispatchability or the reliability, only the cost of generating a unit of energy. And energy consumed at different times has a different value. And nuclear energy reduces the required system capacity and therefore cost of a clean, firm resource as a clean, firm resource. And it doesn't include the value of grid reliability services. So these costs or this analysis shown on the right is generation and transmission system costs with and without nuclear. So this isn't looking at a specific plant. This is looking at the whole system and all of the costs aggregated together. And we find that if you try to have an electric grid with only renewables and storage and you're trying to decarbonize, that will be a lot more expensive than if you have an electric grid that has renewables and storage, but also has nuclear, it also has this clean, firm option. And that's because then you don't have to overbuild the system and you can actually have the clean, firm energy that you need when it's required. So this system cost approach is really important to take into account. Nuclear power plants benefit the electric grid. As I mentioned, clean, firm nuclear energy lowers the overall electric system costs, especially in deep decarbonization scenarios. And dispatchable firm resources mean less capacity is required, lowering the system costs relative to high renewable case. And this shows it for Pacific Northwest Zero Emitting Resources Study that was done. So similar results at a regional level to what I just showed at the national level. And these bars are the blue is a renewables plus storage only scenario. The plus CGS is a scenario where they kept an existing nuclear plant running. The zero emitting firm with the NREL case was a somewhat higher cost advanced nuclear case, and the darker pink is a zero emitting firm case where they used somewhat lower advanced nuclear costs. But you can see that especially in cases where you want to get to zero emissions, having the zero emitting nuclear available makes a big difference in lowering total costs. On the value of learning by doing, it reduces the cost for subsequent projects. We think likely Malaysian projects will not be likely first of a kind, although they'll be first of a kind for you which is important, but we're guessing that you'll be learning from others. But subsequent deployments in local markets with local experience and local workforce are also important, and you'll learn a lot as you go. And this graph is from an analysis of what happened at Vogel, which was a plant in the United States that was completed just last year and was under construction for a long time. And there was a lot of learning between Unit 3 and Unit 4, which they did subsequently. And the dark green shows how long it took to get to certain milestones for building the reactor for Unit 3. And so the dark green is for Unit 3 and the light green is for Unit 4. And you can see that there were major improvements and how long it took to build the reactor unit the second time around. And this is super important because time is money, and they were able to go much faster. And that means that you have a shorter amount of period that you have to get financing, a shorter amount of time that the workforce has to work on the project, and a shorter amount of time till you're ready to actually generate electricity. So these were very important learnings, and this is something that happens and is pretty well understood. What will affect in-country costs are the availability of material and labor, supply chains, domestic or easily accessible abroad, access to financing, both debt and equity, development of a regulatory framework, as I mentioned, and meeting these IAEA milestones in whatever manner a particular country thinks makes the most sense. I mentioned this before, that policy incentives can reduce costs. This is analysis we did at NIA, looking at first of a kind, high, mid, and low case, and the difference that the production tax credit and the investment tax credit can make. And as you can see, it makes a big difference. And again, these tax credits are really important, particularly for early mover projects. And particularly over time, we think that the tax credits will really pay off in terms of getting benefits for the whole system, as everyone benefits from the learning by doing. This is a clean firm technology comparison. I mentioned earlier that if you are going to use the LCOE metric, you really need to compare like to like. And so this is an example of comparing the different clean firm technology options, mainly new nuclear, geothermal, hydropower, 24/7 power purchase agreement with renewables and storage, and natural gas with carbon capture. And if you compare these emerging clean firm options, you find that they're in a similar range. And of course, the reasons to be particularly optimistic with new nuclear is that we have done nuclear before, so we have a lot of experience to build on, although new nuclear is new. But there are certainly all of these clean firm options are comparable in terms of the expected costs, and there's essentially a race that, about which one is going to be the most competitive and cost effective, but also probably we need all of them. We need a lot of clean electricity, clean energy, both here and abroad, and it's likely that we're going to need all of these options, and that the grid of the future and the energy system of the future is going to include nuclear as well as many other options. A little bit on public acceptance. We think that a robust and trusted regulator is a really important part of public acceptance. We also think that early and transparent stakeholder engagement is really important. Public education is really important, as is consent-based siting. It's really important to put nuclear power plants where people want them, make sure that the community understands the case for the plant, the benefits, what it's going to be really like, and really knows what it's doing. And we think that that's the best sort of path forward to success. So fast takeaways from part 2 that which we just completed. Nuclear energy is expected to be cost competitive with other clean firm resources. Nuclear energy lowers overall system cost and a decarbonized grid. Learning by doing reduces costs. Early engagement with international, domestic, and local partners and stakeholders is key. And with that, I will move on to Q&A.
Thank you, Judi. That was fantastic. Wow. I had looked at the slides before, but after your presentation, there's so much to unpack. Just as a reminder to the audience, please post your questions in the Q&A box and not the chat, and we'll address them as we go along. Let me just pick up one from the audience so far. What's it's, I think, more political, perhaps. With the recent shift in US climate stance, particularly under the incoming Trump's administration policies promoting fossil fuels, how does the US plan to reconcile these actions with its global leadership role in climate change and commitment to net zero? As a world leader expected to set an example, what's the pathway forward to demonstrate consistent, decisive action towards a sustainable and climate resilient future?
So I'll sort of modify the question a bit to what I know, which is more
Yeah.
about nuclear. Fortunately or not, depending on your perspective, there's quite broad bipartisan support in the United States for nuclear energy. A lot of that is because of climate. That's certainly one of the reasons that our organization is very supportive of nuclear energy. But a lot of people support nuclear energy for other reasons, like energy security, reliability, being available all the times at all times. As I talked about in our in part one, I showed the capacity factors for nuclear plants, which are quite high. You really can depend on them. That's very important. And so I think there's, at least in the United States context, I think there will still be a lot of motivation to get more nuclear power, not only for climate reasons, but for all these other reasons as well. So I do think that at least for this particular issue, US leadership on nuclear energy, I think, is quite durable, and we expect that it will continue, and we'll be continuing with the policy and incentives that we've put in place, and effective implementation, partnering with other countries, and all that work. There's no guarantee, obviously, a new administration comes in, they do what they decide to do, but we do think that there's such broad support in Congress and across the US political system that we expect that this leadership will continue.
Right, thank you. We have another question here from Lutik Gee. In terms of carbon emission reduction, how does nuclear energy offer the best solution, and how does wind energy feature?
Yeah, so we think it's a really important part. We think that you're going to need a lot of technologies. We see nuclear as a piece at the moment. So somewhat interestingly, and most people don't realize that, we get about close to 20% of our electricity from nuclear energy in the United States, but that's actually close to half of our clean electricity. So in terms of already, nuclear energy plays a very big role in the United States in producing clean electricity and helping us to meet our climate goals. But there's also lots of other technologies. Wind and solar are growing. There's growing interest in geothermal. So we see a whole suite of technologies. We also see a lot of interest in hydrogen. There's a lot of use for or need for zero carbon fuels like hydrogen. So I think that we think that just as we have now, where we have many different sources of energy, we imagine that going forward, we will continue to have it. And we think that nuclear energy is a key piece of that. It's not the only piece, but we think it's a very important piece.
Yeah, I think you framed it quite well. It's not either or, but all of the above, yeah. Given the demand that people have for electricity. So another one here, you mentioned 10 to 15 years of deployment. This from Mazli Noor. What is the approximate timeline for each of these phases, just to have a feel for which phase we can expedite? I think we want to try and beat America.
It's actually a good question. I don't know. I don't actually know how they allocated it. The only thing I've seen is that, in total, that's what they were looking at. I imagine they're giving themselves some flex on that. But certainly, I think in some countries, it will take longer to get to a decision to go forward. But then once they have that decision, they could potentially move rapidly. I think other countries might move more quickly to just make the decision, but then it might take them longer to actually operationalize that if they haven't gotten the buy-in. So I think that there is some flexibility of that, and I'm guessing it varies by country.
Right, thank you. So, some people, when they hear 10 to 15 years, they'll never get around to it, But it reminds me of that phrase, when's the best time to plant a tree? Maybe 10, 15 years ago. When's the next best time today? Let's touch on costs. I mean, it's quite heartening to note that you mentioned in Malaysia, we're probably not first of a kind because we'll be learning from others. At what point is nth of a kind at its optimum? Is it the second plant or the third or the fourth? Do we have any idea how many plants we have to do to get it right?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I don't know the answer for sure. Certainly, we think we keep getting better at it. I would say the first guessing, 5 is probably, you get most of your learning, but it varies by technology, and certainly the more you do, the more you learn. But we do think that the first few plants are the ones where you get the steepest part of the learning curve, I would say. And that's really why we think for those first few, at least in the US context, we need these incentives and public-private partnerships to get them going, to get that learning, and then have that learning benefit everyone.
Okay, thank you. So Mel, I'm going to refer you to the part 1 video. Your question of, in terms of nuclear energy, how would Malaysia make sure the plant wouldn't have a meltdown similar to the Japanese tragedy? And we did address that quite at length. Again, another question from Lu Tokgi. The cost of generation from nuclear energy is still relatively high compared to other fuel types. How can we make nuclear energy viable? We are in Malaysia and explored this option before, but the cost was prohibitive. That's why ASEAN countries abandoned this idea much earlier.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we do think for these first few, it is going to be higher, but we also think it will be lower over time, and it should be, we expect it to be affordable and a good option. And it's, as I mentioned, with all my caveats and the different charts about how to think about costs, I do think it's important to understand what you're comparing to what. If you are comparing to building, for example, a conventional fossil fuel plant, it could be that nuclear would be more expensive. But if you're trying to reduce carbon emissions, then you have to go with something that's cleaner. And I think if you do try to build out your grid, we think that renewables have an important role. But if you only do renewables, then you won't have the firmness and reliability that you need. So I think if you look at it on a system basis, we actually do think that it's cost effective and certainly will become so over time.
Yeah, and it's interesting because there seems to be a dichotomy. On the one hand, people complain about nuclear being too expensive, and therefore, fossil fuels end up being the easy answer. But on the other hand, that as you've shown on your slide, with wind, solar, and batteries, the addition of nuclear brings the cost down by 37%. So I'm not sure, how it is expensive. And then perhaps the other thing that isn't factored in, these plants are licensed for 50 years, but they're going longer, up to 80 years. So they probably have been amortized at too steep a curve in the early days.
Yeah, that's really very important, is that once you build a nuclear plant, you have it for a very long time. So that investment has a long time to pay off. And that's something that's particularly true for nuclear energy, much more so than other energy technologies. These plants last a really long time.
Yeah, thank you. This question is from Ikwan Caleb. There's a lot of emerging advanced reactor technology with a strong existing supply chain and profound understanding for LWR, I think light water reactors. How likely do you think non-LWR technologies will make its appearance in the next decade?
So we think it's likely. We actually think you'll probably have both. Certainly in the United States, we're going to have both because we have a pretty significant fleet of light water reactors that we expect to continue to operate for some time. And we have these couple of new light water reactors that just got built, the Vogtle plant that I mentioned. So we definitely see light water reactors in our future, and we also see these new technologies emerging. And I think that, as I talked about last time, there are different use cases for nuclear energy where we think different technologies might really work. So for example, microreactors, which are advanced reactors, not light water generally, would be much more appropriate, for example, for a remote location that doesn't have a very large demand. And so that's interesting. Small modular reactors are particularly of interest, and particularly high temperature gas reactors are of particular interest to certain types of industries who need not only the electricity, but also the high temperature heat that a high temperature gas reactor can produce. So there's a bunch of different use cases where we think advanced reactors will play. And so we think that sort of like the competition with the other types of completely different types of energy systems, we think that there's probably a role for multiple types of reactors. We don't think all of them will wind up succeeding. That would probably be too many, but we do think that there's a lot of innovation going on. A lot of different companies are competing for investment and working on attracting customers. We think some of them will succeed, not just one, but that several of these designs will succeed in these different use cases.
Oh, that's interesting that you brought it up, because I think a lot of people aren't aware that industrial heating accounts for a big chunk of energy consumption worldwide. You think it's just electricity in our homes. We have here a question which from Eileen C. With the potential capital outlay required, despite SMRs, do you see challenges in financing for nuclear energy, especially for developing nations, which may not be able to rely on extended government funding support? And if I could just throw in one of the questions I've been wanting to ask also, what are the cost benefits or trade-off associated with SMRs compared to large-scale traditional reactors?
That was, I think, a couple of questions.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
The first one about, if there's no extended government funding, what are the challenges in financing then for developing nations?
I do think for these early mover projects that, sort of getting that financing is important. And there are different options, and there's actually, there's obviously domestic support, but there's also international potential support. We have our Ex-Im Bank. There are other international entities that could potentially give support for early mover projects. Again, also, I think if Malaysia is sort of a second mover, they'll benefit from those early mover projects that occurred elsewhere, and they should see lower costs. And so we would want to make sure that, I would suggest that you would want to make sure that you get that benefit. And either by being, the second of a kind, or partnering with other companies or entities that have some experience, so that you can see realize these benefits of lower costs. And certainly to the extent that you can, public incentives, tax incentives would be very helpful.
And my question about the cost benefit trade-offs between SMRs compared to large scale traditional reactors.
Yeah, so historically we built nuclear power plants big because we got economies of scale, so that is important. The other type of economy you can get, and what people are excited about for small modular reactors and for microreactors, is that you can get the economy of multiples, where instead of building one big plant, you can build several small plants, a lot of which potentially you could build in a factory. Because what's most expensive about a large nuclear power plant is that a lot of it has to be stick built on site. And so if instead you can do a lot more at a manufacturing facilities and build a lot of components at the same time, you can get the scale of manufacturing. And so that's the expectation and the promise of both the small reactors and the microreactors. Having said that, the first few, before you get that economy of scale, won't get that, but that's the idea, is that over time you'll get these multiples.
Thank you. This is a technology question from one Rumaizi. What are your thoughts on the Enron egg, a micro nuclear reactor developed by Enron?
I'm not familiar with that.
Okay, thank you. In your opinion, which type of nuclear plants would be suitable for the west and east coast of Malaysia, micro, small, or large? Maybe that's a very country-specific one.
And the particular use that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And where it is, and yeah.
I suppose if the goal is to target the phase out of, say, coal plants being the dirtiest, then it would just sort of sit on the same site, but have the same capacity to replace one for the other.
Yeah, so, just it differs by country, by, the power plant, but at least typically in the US, a coal plant will be kind of the size of a small modular reactor or two. And so that's something. So for example, I talked about this last time. We have a project in the US that's being built in Wyoming that's going to replace a retiring coal plant. And it's a similar size. It's a small modular reactor that's a similar size to the coal plant that it's replacing. So that's sort of, a few 100-megawatt type size. There are coal plants that are larger, but coal plants typically are a little bit smaller than nuclear plants. So, one or two or three, depending on the modular size and how many modules would be more typical if you could get a small modular reactor or two to replace a coal plant.
This one's from Rosman Hamza. If Malaysia opted for small modular reactors, would regulatory requirements be less stringent than conventional nuclear power plants? Is an SMR more publicly palatable?
So we think the requirements have to be just as stringent from a performance perspective. We think they should require, at least as much safety. The issue is, can you set up your requirements in such a way that they're what we would describe as performance-based, so that they actually take into account the benefits of the particular technology. The problem that we have in the US, which you wouldn't have because you'd be developing a new regulator, is that we have a lot of very specific rules that really only apply to light water reactors. So if you're coming in with a different type of technology, you have to, ask for exemptions or figure out a way around these very specific rules that aren't performance-based. So what we advocate for and what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is working on are more performance-based approaches, where the new design can, a person who has a new design can come in and demonstrate to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission why they're safe. They may achieve the safety in a much different manner, but they are certainly at least as safe as the existing fleet.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a good question there as well, because, and I'm sure you've come across it in your research and advocacy, but when I was at the World Nuclear Association Symposium in London last September, I think they mentioned that maybe 100 different SMR technologies out there. I'm not sure if anyone's keeping count. So if Malaysia says large nuclear power plants are too expensive or too big, let's go SMRs, where do we start? How do we know?
It's a really good question. And, we think they're all very interesting. And so you have to go through a process and look at the different technologies. And, I do think that, depending how your process works, it would, there'd be some type of process where you would seek bids from different companies. You would look at what they're suggesting and recommending, and they'd have to make their case. So I do think that that the good thing is that there are a lot of these different options. And of course, the bad thing is that you then have to make a choice. But I'd certainly look to what other choices other people are making, particularly if you don't want to go first, if you want to go second, you sort of could build on those examples and, benefit from the due diligence that others have done to try out different technologies. But at the moment, we have this very interesting time where we're doing sort of a big sorting where lots of different technologies are being offered, and, we'll see who actually turns out to be best. But we think there are a lot of good contenders, and at the moment, we don't have a specific opinion about who's the best.
That's interesting, because if we are looking for nth of a kind in the SMR world, maybe Malaysia may need to consider the tried and tested in the short run. The Westinghouse AP1000, your Hitachi BW RX 1000, or the Canadian Can-Do Monarch, and then when a few countries have the SMRs up and running, you actually see the performance.
It depends on the timing and when you actually have to pick your technology, right?
Yeah.
If you're in a process where you're standing up your regulator and you're, getting a lot of other things done in parallel, there'll be progress made. on the advanced reactors, and you could learn from that as well.
Actually, yeah, that's a good point, because in the 5 or 10 years that it takes us to set up the regulatory environment, we may actually have a few come online to be able to assess. Yeah, good. As renewable technologies advance, will nuclear power continue to be cost competitive, or will alternatives like solar and wind become cheaper?
It's a good question. I do think that, we talked earlier about how the early part of a learning curve is the steepest. So we do think for these advanced reactors, because they're relatively new, that we're going to learn a lot and get pretty steep cost reductions, whereas the cost for solar and wind have fallen considerably in the past couple of decades. So we would expect that they would continue to decline, but not as steeply. So we expect that they'll become closer. But it is important for solar and wind to understand that in order to compare them with getting comparable benefits from a nuclear plant, you would have to pair the solar and wind with some type of storage technology. And so that's really where you have to compare clean firm to clean firm. Otherwise, you're not doing a fair comparison. And then you also have to make sure when you're looking at costs, as I mentioned earlier, that you're not comparing, costs with incentives to technologies that don't have incentives. For many years, we've had production tax credits and investment test credits available for renewables in our country. And then nuclear and other technologies had to compete without those incentives. But now nuclear energy also has those incentives. So it's that playing field has become level. But it's very important when you're comparing costs to look at costs fairly across whether they have incentives or not.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I also bring up this one that perhaps people may give pushback to nuclear. The Australian CSIRO, which is I think the energy agency, have come out with a report that says renewables are the cheapest and nuclear is very expensive. So I don't know how to juxtaposition that with what you mentioned about the U.S. Department of Energy's report that says when you introduce nuclear into decarbonization using renewables and batteries, the cost comes down by 37%. So what do you think is going on there?
So I haven't seen their report, and what I would do, and what I'd advise you to do with any report that has costs, is look at these questions that I laid out. Are they comparing like to like? Are they taking into account that you're comparing a firm energy source to a variable energy source? Are you looking at the whole system cost? Are you looking at first of a kind versus nth of a kind, so that the first few might be more expensive, but then ultimately they'll be cheaper? Are you comparing technologies that have incentives to technologies that don't have incentives? So you really have to make sure that you're doing a fair comparison. And so that's what I haven't looked at this report, but that's what I would do. I'd look at the report and see, what exactly they're comparing to what, and then make a judgment.
Yeah. I'll throw one more in. Would you trust a country that has one experimental nuclear plant making medical isotopes? Or would you compare a country which has 90 over nuclear plants getting 20% of their electricity through nuclear? Yeah. The other question that was brought up also is financial models available to fund nuclear energy development, public-private partnerships. I think you shared a few in America, but do you see that happening elsewhere?
Yeah, so definitely in the US, we have a lot of that where the government is, essentially co-funding projects with the private sector. We certainly see that in Canada, the UK, a number of other countries as well. So yes, there are. It's not just us who are doing that. That is something that we're doing, but so are some other countries.
Yeah, and would that require? I mean, in Malaysia, we have a national electricity board, and they do have independent private power producers, but maybe gas or coal, etc. But with nuclear, it almost feels like it has to stay government, or would you trust private sector to pick it up?
It's a good question. So there's different models. For example, in France, which has a lot of nuclear energy, it's basically a state-owned utility that runs a lot of, I think, all of their plants. In the U.S., the model we have is mixed, where we have public utilities own most of our nuclear power plants, but we also have independent power producers own nuclear plants. We also, when you have a public utility in the U.S., it's regulated by the state. So we do have a, largely private sector owned nuclear energy system, but we are regulated for safety by the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. I certainly think that's critical no matter how you go in terms of the business model or the economic regulation. But certainly it's very important that you have a trusted regulator who makes sure that that the companies keep the plant safe. And we've had a really good record in the U.S. of keeping the plants very safe, and I think that is credit for that goes to both the industry and the regulator.
Right. Yeah, and I think in part one you also showed how safe nuclear energy is in terms of deaths per terawatt hour worldwide. It's one of the lowest next to wind and solar. We have an anonymous attendee asking, what is the best approach for Malaysia with a peak load demand of 20 gigawatts or 20,000 megawatts in selecting the optimum SMR capacity, whether to go straight to a nominal 300 megawatt or go for a smaller capacity? And I would also question, or go for the 1 gigawatt.
So I don't know. I think I would not presume to advise on that particular one. Certainly you would want to do a scenario analysis of trying out different ones and different mixes and see what it looks like, and also see what opportunities you have with particular vendors. And I think it would have to be. I wouldn't want to comment on that and off the cuff. I think that would be an important decision. And also, one of the advantages of doing multiples is you could do them in series. So that could have some advantage where you do one and then you could do the next and you learn from the first, as opposed to just going all in on one. But the other hand, you get the economies of scale. So it would be a more complicated decision than just knowing off the top of my head.
Well, you use interesting catchphrase that different mixes, right? So it could be like which type of energy generation. It could be all of the above in terms of sizing of nuclear plants. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And you have to fit it into your existing system. What plants are you going to keep online? What retirement are you seeing? What growth rate are you seeing? This is something that's like changing rapidly in real time in the US. Is just recently pretty much every utility in the US has adjusted their demand forecasts, and we're now expecting very rapid growth in electricity demand, which is a relatively new projection. That was not what people were predicting just a couple of years ago. So in an environment of demand growth, there's more room for more reactors, more large reactors, and it's sort of you have more opportunity to do investment if you actually have the demand to support it. Yeah,
fantastic. I also read the US Department of Energy report last year is it last year or the year before, that highlighted up to 2/3 of coal plants could be replaced by SMRs in the US, which maybe is a hint to what we could do in Malaysia. If we're not sure about the size, well, if we're replacing that coal plant, what size is it? And let's match it with clean energy, right?
Yeah. And in the US context, what we are finding with replacing coal plants is that, if they are retiring, they have a lot of assets that help you to bring down the costs from what they'd be otherwise at sort of a new site. A lot of times they already have transmission access, which in our country is a big issue. It's a big investment issue. It's also a big public policy issue about how do you make the decision, how do you site transmission, and how do you build it. So having that access already, also these tend to be sites that are already zoned for power. And so you already have the infrastructure around the plant. You have people in the community who have expertise in working on power plants. You know, there's certainly, they may not have nuclear expertise, but there's a lot of expertise between coal and nuclear plants that's shared. So you have a lot of advantages if you're going to replace a retiring coal plant with a nuclear plant in terms of physical assets, community assets, worker assets.
I think that comes back to your point earlier where nuclear energy is as affordable when you look at it from a total system cost. And one of which is that the grid's there. You don't have to build a grid into the middle of nowhere to get the wind and solar, which is typically what happens. And you mentioned the community. I saw another interview with Julie Kozaraki from the US Department of Energy. And she said that the approval ratings for nuclear are highest from those living closest to it. Because they know it's clean, they know it provides high-paying jobs, they know they've got secure electricity. That's interesting. I think, let me see, we're out of question. Oh no, sorry, some more caught up again. Okay, we've answered that one. In many cases, regulators do not have enough knowledge, and that's scary, especially in poor governance countries. That's not making a judgment on Malaysia necessarily, but how do you address that about, you know, the regulatory framework and the knowledge required?
Yeah, I do think it's very important to have smart regulators. You know, that's important. It's going to take training. You know, building out a nuclear energy sector, you need people who can build power plants. You also need the regulators. I mean, I think it's a lot like other types of capacity building. It's about training. It's about learning from other countries. It's about borrowing expertise where you can. It's about, you know, for example, if the US or Canada or UK makes a decision that a technology is safe, then your regulator can take that into account and doesn't have to do as much work themselves. I also think, at least in the US context, we do put a lot of burden on the applicant themselves to demonstrate their safety. So it's not just about the regulator having to figure it out all themselves. It's about a regulator reviewing an expert developer or builder of a nuclear plant to make the case that it's safe. So I do think that there are, it's very important to have competent regulator and to work on that and to build that capacity. There's also lots of ways on your way to building that capacity where you can learn from others and also rely on what industry presents and also what others have certified as being safe.
Yeah, that's a good one. And then also maybe give a shout out for the World Nuclear Association Symposium that's happening the first week of September every year. If there are any Malaysian regulators out there, please do attend. You get a network of 700 to 800 in the nuclear industry, from regulators, from governments, from plant manufacturers, from utilities, from uranium mining companies. So you get a feel for the network. And I think they have a public policy division that can help steer the way. And also, you know, coming back to Nuclear Innovation Alliance, what kind of resources in your website that you could point us to that maybe can get us started thinking?
Okay, so that may have to be a part 3. So,
right, that's so much.
Our website is full of information, sort of at whatever level you want. You know, we have very basic information, you know, fact sheets, 1 or 2 pages. We have very deep reports. We have a 100-page report on high assay, low enriched uranium. If you're interested, you know, there's just, it's kind of like everything you would want to know. Certainly, happy to walk you through or others through all of the resources we have. And also, you know, you can start on your own navigating, but we really try to have resources to get people started and to answer questions. We also are happy to produce new resources, you know, assuming we have the bandwidth that people need. So if there are questions and you can't find the answers, on our website. You can let us know, and then we can see if lots of people want that information. We can potentially produce new resources. But we have a lot
Okay.
on our website. I showed a few at the beginning as examples, but it's really quite a bit.
Perfect, perfect. Well, we'll link the website in the show notes. But for those of you who want more information, go to nuclearinnovationalliance.org.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And,
unfortunately, you have to spell out the whole thing.
Yeah. That's okay. We'll link it in the show notes to make it easy for them to
Yeah,
get
somebody
to.
else took the NIA URL, so we have to do Nuclear Innovation Alliance.
Okay. So Oliver Kumaran asks, at what level should countries' safety and compliance culture be at to ensure effective nuclear safety? Is there any robust study data to show that Malaysia has the necessary capabilities and expertise to effectively implement the controls and compliance mechanisms, continuous and consistent annual investments, and operational budgetary needs for safety mechanisms to ensure nuclear safety?
So certainly, Malaysia has very sophisticated infrastructure for a lot of other technologies. So I would think that there's, certainly the potential, but certainly that is something that you would have to do and you'd have to work on. And I think the IAEA milestone approach would help you get started on that, assess what you already have, what you already know, and then you would have to potentially develop additional expertise and make sure that that you can handle the technology, that you can have the regulatory oversight that you need, and that you can develop the sector, that the industrial sector, to actually implement it. But certainly there's a lot of very highly technical industries in Malaysia, and I think that there's no reason to believe that you couldn't do the same for nuclear energy.
Yeah, that's a good one. I think I get that question a lot, and I say, well, imagine being 30,000 feet in the air in a shell that a gazillion and one things could go wrong, and you could end up in a ball of fire. But in Malaysia, we have 3 airlines with pretty good safety record.
Yeah.
Okay. And then how about, would like to hear a success story of similar developing country like Malaysia, who is already embarked in this partnership program or currently making good progress?
Yeah, and that was my UAE example.
Yep.
There probably are others, but we did a little research on that one in preparation for this, so I can definitely talk about that. And then I'll send you more information about other countries. We probably have some other information, but I think that's a nice recent example. They went through the IAE process. They successfully built plants. I'm recapping what I said earlier. They used a lot of labor and design and expertise from outside their country, and in parallel, they built up expertise in country. And so I think they are a really nice example of recent success. They had very clear government commitment. They've developed a very robust regulator. I think a lot of the ingredients are there for you to learn from.
I also it brings a smile to my face as well, because there's one country with plenty of deserts for as much solar and a lot of sun, plenty of desert and sun, and much solar as you want, and then they put 4 nuclear AP 1400s there to generate 5.6 gigawatts.
Said, it's not an either or. You probably need both.
Well, and the 4 plants now provide, I think, 25% of the country's electricity as well.
It's so funny because 1 or 2 of these plants just produces an awesome amount of energy, and we need energy, and we need clean energy.
Yeah, that's great. So before we close, are there any final thoughts you would like to share with the audience?
Sure. I'll just say I so appreciate that you're taking such a considerate approach to this and really thinking it through. This is exactly, in my view, what you ought to be doing. So I really commend you and your colleagues for really digging in, and happy to be a resource for you as you navigate this. and would certainly defer to you all as you look through, what's best for your country and your energy system, but happy to provide whatever resources we can to help you inform that decision.
Okay, thank you very much. And so I also like to thank the audience. I think almost everyone has stayed to the end, and in a couple of days, you'll get an email with the link of this recording, because there's so much that Judi has shared with us that we need to watch it a few times to get the full impact. But thank you again, Judi, on behalf of Climate Governance Malaysia, and also thank the US Embassy for their support. We like to wish all of you a good day. I'll pass it back to to GTN. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Judi and Dato Tong, for offering such meaningful and insightful contributions. One of the big takeaways I found really interesting was that you can't look at the cost of nuclear energy in isolation. At first glance, it might seem expensive, but that view doesn't factor in its incredible reliability, which keeps the grid stable. And when we look at deep decarbonization, the kind of scenarios we need to aim for, nuclear energy actually lowers the overall cost of the electricity system. Plus, as we start building reactors and developing the infrastructure and workforce, learning by doing, the costs are likely to come down over time. So, thank you, Ms. Judi. And before we conclude, we kindly ask you to share your thoughts through our feedback survey. We want to hear from you, and your feedback will be most helpful in shaping future initiatives. This event has been recorded and will be made available on the Climate Governance Malaysia YouTube channel, complete with time-tag content and accompanying blog posts. We invite you to stay engaged with us through our CGM newsletter and our official LinkedIn page for continued updates. On behalf of our team, thank you to all of you, speakers and participants, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today for this webinar and engaging in this crucial conversation. As we draw this series to a close, we hope it has sparked meaningful discussions and provided practical perspectives on the role of nuclear energy in today's world. Wishing you all a pleasant afternoon, or whatever time it is where you are, and we hope to see you again.